Hi, everyone. Welcome to Happy to See Me, the podcast that puts the spotlight on the overlooked and underestimated. I'm Erika Casupanan, and this week I am speaking to Kaitlin Narciso. But first, I love to start each episode talking about something I was happy to see this week. Over the winter months, I've been trying to embrace living softly, or at least soft for me. I do like to go out and socialize quite often, but I've been trying to spend more time inside and reading books. So I would love to tell you about a book I just read. The book I just read was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This book came out in 2022, and it follows the friendship between these two childhood friends as they grow up to become creative partners, and then they create this successful multi-million-dollar video game company together. Why I loved it is there were so many complex themes. You got to explore what happens in a relationship when there's love, but it's not necessarily a romantic relationship, and how relationships can get impacted by fame and how fame can impact creativity. So highly recommend it. And let me know. I'm trying to read more books this year. So if you would like me to share more about the books that I am reading, let me know in the comments. And maybe I can make it a somewhat regular happy to see at the start of each episode. And of course, if you have any book recommendations, feel free to let me know in the comments. Let's get to this week's interview. I am speaking to content creator and journalist Kaitlin Narciso. Kaitlin currently is an entrepreneur and she specializes in culinary and travel content. Kaitlin started out as a journalist and she was able to pivot and is now the owner of her own agency. In this episode, we are talking about career pivots and content creation and journalism. Kaitlin talks about what it was like leaving her quote-unquote dream job that she landed early in her career, and then dealing with imposter syndrome when she started entrepreneurship. This is a very fun conversation for me as you hear us nerd out in talking about all things social media and journalism. Plus, there are many inspirational nuggets for people who are thinking of making a career change or a career pivot. So I think you will enjoy this conversation. Here is my interview with Kaitlin Narciso. When I was looking you up, I was pleasantly surprised to see that we did the same program at Western.
MIT?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, love it. Yes.
Yes, except I'm a few years older than you, so we did not overlap, unfortunately, but I love running into another MIT grad out in the wild.
How did you like it?
So I loved it. I remember leaving high school and thinking, oh, I'm interested in media, but thinking about it, but I felt like there was no real place for it. And then when I went and did this program, I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I wanted to study. And it turns out that it exists somewhere.
Yeah, I feel like I was very much the same. I was always like interested in journalism, but then also like interested in media as like the more broad scape of an industry. And so when I like first found out about this program, it was between, I think, journalism at Carleton University and then MIT at Western.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, like my brother went to Western and my cousin went to Western. And that's why I chose it. And I'm so happy I did, because like the program, it's so cool and it's so different. And I don't think you get it many other places.
How would you describe the program to somebody who was not in it? This is the hardest question too. If you have studied this program and you hear this question, you know exactly what I mean by this being a hard question. So I'm putting you on the spot. How would you describe it?
Okay, so it's journalism, but it's like if you took like a sci-fi movie and you did journalism in like sci-fi movie, that's how it is, because you're not just learning about journalism like in the very like strategic sense of like being in front of a camera. You're learning about like the basics of it and like all like the behind the scenes and all of the implications of the journalism industry and the media industry as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like kind of this like dystopian, but like also very positive outlook on journalism.
I have never heard anyone describe it like this, but I love that. I also just saw Dune a few days ago, so I'm like, yes, turn our school program into a sci-fi genre program.
I mean, I remember studying Blade Runner back in the day, but if Dune came out when we were in that program, you know there would be a course on it in MIT.
Completely. Oh my gosh, I remember having to watch Blade Runner when I was in first year. This is such a throwback. Yeah. When I describe it to people, I say that it's like a media studies program, but it's also rooted in cultural theory, and that since we are reviewing media so critically and we're using anthropology and psychology and sociology to understand what is happening and also deconstruct what's happening technologically in a really critical way, it's interesting because I feel like we do that program and it sets us up to be very critical of media and then marketing. And then so many of us end up working in media and marketing and digital storytelling. But I'm like, oh, I think we're actually really set up to do it because if you can take something apart, you can put it back together.
100%. And I think like that's the beautiful thing about the program is that it approaches it in such a unique and interesting way where it's not necessarily the mainstream as much as a lot of people I think it's going to be. It is very much how can we be critical of this industry and how can we make it better in a lot of ways. And so that's what really like made me love it.
Yes, 100%. And this podcast is not sponsored by the University of Western Ontario, but if you would like to sponsor it, 2 alumni just gave glowing reviews.
Yeah. Western, right here.
Yes. So, Kaitlin, I know we're going to get into your whole career path, but for now, can you let everyone know at a high level what it is you do?
So essentially, I own my own content creation agency. And under that, I have a few different clients in the journalism sphere, as well as just clients on the content side. One of my clients being where I actually sit as the executive of socials is Streets of Toronto. And so I handle everything from like the video production team to the content creators and write for them and create content as well as stuff for like creating content for different food brands like Savory Imports, Tom Mine, to name a few, and then kind of a little bit of everything. I'm also a travel journalist, so I write for Drift Travel Magazine and create content for different tourism boards. It's a hodgepodge thing.
Well, where you are now with this hodgepodge, this was not the initial dream, right? This was something that had to change a lot over time.
For sure. I actually started right out of university, or in university, I had an internship at CTV with the Marilyn Dennis Show as a production intern. And I graduated a year early, actually, because I was offered a job with CTV, and MIT is such a great program that they were like, well, this is kind of what you're going to school for. So we expedited my degree and ended up working at CTV for, I think, 3 or 4 years and thought I was always going to stay in broadcast television. I loved it for the first parts, but then I started realizing more and more how big of a role digital media is playing in just everyday life and is really the trajectory of where the industry is going. And I felt like CTV at the time wasn't doing a lot of digital media. And eventually, as I started writing for publications just as side hustles, I got to the point where I was writing enough and creating content enough for different clients that I pulled the trigger and jumped out onto my own.
When I was working in public relations, I think it was around the same time that you were at CTV, you were at the Marilyn Dennis Show. For those who are not from Canada, that was a really popular daytime talk show here in Canada. And I remember when I was working in public relations, for one, the relationship between public relations and journalism is so intertwined. And the story I was always hearing is that journalism is really under fire right now. There's not really a lot of resources. All the budgets are being cut. Journalists are getting let go. So when you were working in daytime TV, were you hearing that and experiencing that too? And was there a signal that it was time for you to shift and do something else?
So the crazy part too is when I was with the social full time, one of the first really big restructurings at Bell Media happened. And I was lucky enough because I wasn't union, so it didn't really affect me, but I saw how it affected everyone else. When you go through a restructuring, regardless of whether it's affecting you or affecting your coworkers, you feel it, right? It's such a scary thing to be a part of in any industry, but with the journalism one specifically, or the media industry specifically, I think, we had all heard these rumblings of, well, broadcast television, is it a thing of the past? Like we kind of know with newspapers even, is it a dying breed? And I think I've always kind of known that there are elements of these industries that will still carry on and I think will still have a lot of importance. But the multimedia element of these is, I think, the absolute key now, as opposed to once it was you could just have a successful show and be good, or you could just have a successful newspaper and be good. But now you need like the TikTok backing, you need the Instagram backing, you need to also have articles online that are trending and all of these different moving pieces.
It's so true because it's like now you need to have so many more skills, right? You can be an incredible reporter, you can write the most informative article, but
Mhm,
then, yes, there's so much pressure now to do all of the storytelling around it. So, in
mhm.
terms of those digital storytelling skills, were you able to start building those when you were working in broadcast TV? Like, where did those come in?
For sure. I think the nice thing about working at CTV was whether or not I was necessarily doing the journalism myself, I was always learning from some of the best in the biz. And I think a lot of the things that I wanted to do and the personalities that I wanted to inspire to be like, I met a lot of them at CTV, like Melissa Grello, Cynthia Loyce, Lainey Louie, and Jess Allen. All of these ladies of the social are such strong presence and are absolutely amazing in storytelling that it inspired me to be better and hone in my craft. So even though I wasn't necessarily doing it with the social, I was taking from them the lessons that I needed and honing in my own craft and doing it for my personal socials or for the different publications that I wrote for or created content for.
Okay, so it was kind of always on the side. You were putting more tools in your toolbox as you were going.
Exactly.
For folks who don't know the context of it, if they're anyone who is outside of Canada, CTV is one of the biggest TV networks here in Canada. When I was on the Traders Canada a few months ago, it aired on CTV. So you were fortunate in that you were able to work at CTV right out of school. So you were quite early in your career and working for these daytime shows. They were one of the top daytime shows that were in Canada at that time. And
Yeah.
then when you knew it was time to walk away, one, can you explain, when you figured out it was time to walk away? And then how do you come to terms with leaving what could be seen as the dream job for somebody?
Yeah. I think a lot of people, when I told them I was leaving, were shocked because it's a big move. And yeah, I think a lot of people, when you have that dream job, it can be scary to venture out, especially on your own. I knew it was the time for me just because I wasn't feeling fulfilled as much anymore in doing it. I knew I wanted to tell more stories than I was able to tell. And I wanted to be able to kind of control the content that I was putting out. I think one day I honestly just woke up and realized that maybe it's time for me to do my own thing. And I was lucky enough to have the support of my closest friends, my family. I decided the day that I was going to give my notice that I was also going to go to Seneca to like hone in my skills on the multimedia journalism scale. So I did the summer program there. And that really helped because then I didn't feel like it was just this abyss of you're jumping into nothing.
Mhm.
And I know this is maybe like a cop out answer, but I think one day you just know.
Yeah, yeah. Did you
Mhm.
experience any grief or something having to let go of this dream come true?
Oh yeah, I think that's the thing, right? With CTV, there was also a lot of cool experiences. I was lucky enough to work on the MMBAs, if you remember those, and Jingle Bell, the concert when it was here. It's not even called Jingle Bell; it's like Jingle Rock or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
So there's so much like interesting and cool things that you get to do. And it's like this glamified version of the industry in many, many ways. And I was a talent and guest coordinator, so I got to meet so many cool people. Everyone that was coming into the building, I was pretty much hanging out with, making sure that they were prepared for their segments, getting them out there and everything. And it's such a glamified job that you're like, "Am I really giving this up to just jump?" And yeah.
Yeah, sometimes the jump, even though it seems scary and even though it might not seem like it makes sense on paper, is the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, like, if you're not scared, I don't think you're necessarily even I don't even know if it's, like, you're not ready, but it's, like, if you're not scared, you maybe don't care enough about it.
Yeah.
Like, because I really like, I knew when I left, like, I really, really, really wanted to make it work, and I knew that this was, like, the wise words of Eminem, "You only got one shot." You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
there's all this pressure, external pressure to make it work. And I think when you care about something, it's always going to be scary.
exactly. You can always end up on the other side of it.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize the timeline in that you went to your undergrad and then you worked in daytime TV and then you went to journalism school. So then what is it like going back to school after you've been in the field for a few years?
So honestly, rewarding. I think I was able to take everything that I had learned at CTV and at MIT and apply it in new ways and have a different lens on this Seneca program. And I think with Seneca too, the really nice thing about it was that it was so hands on and everything was made applicable.
Mhm.
So everything that I had learned, we were able to reposition in a way that I could use it in the multimedia sphere. So whether that was reporting live in front of camera, talking to camera, writing script, doing radio, doing podcasts, we were able to take all of those lessons that I had very much experienced and turn it into a practice, which was nice. Of course, I was only doing it for the summer, so it also didn't feel like this overwhelming, like 3 to 4 year program. And I could just really, really embrace it as well as do my side projects at the time, too.
Oh, yeah, and with the experience that you already had, it probably made you appreciate all of the tangible skills that you were learning in school. It wasn't just you trying to absorb those things while you were doing your TV job. You could actually focus on picking up the skills.
Exactly. Learning will never be a disservice. So it's always going to be a benefit to continue learning. I think a lot of people forget that we're never too old to learn a new skill
Mhm.
or hone in on our craft. I think there's always elements to learn, relearn, and get better at. And I think with school, like with the Seneca program, it really, really helped me even change the way maybe I was taught one thing to benefit how it would now be in the industry that exists now. Because also when we went to school and like now, the industry is quite different.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
100%.
yeah. And I mean, like, I guess it kind of shows our age, but like nearly a decade ago now when we were in Western, it's a whole different media landscape. Like TikTok didn't exist back, or maybe it did exist, but it wasn't to the extreme that it is now. And podcasts weren't even as popular as they are now. Like the podcast was radio back then. Now radio is typically more only music.
Oh, TikTok definitely did not exist when I was at school. I remember writing an essay that talked about the pros and cons of a society where everybody has cell phones or whether they don't have cell phones. I feel like that's forever ago. So
Mhm.
things have changed a lot. So I'm in my mid 30s and I encounter lots of people who all of a sudden have epiphanies and they need to change their career path. And I encounter a lot of people who think about going back to school, but then they have all these insecurities about it. Like, am I behind? Am I too old? Did you experience any of those insecurities going back to school and how did you get over them?
I think that's the thing. I think a lot of people are raised to believe it's school, university, work, right? And that is the trajectory of your life. But a lot of the times, life isn't that way. It's not just this straight and narrow path or a ladder that we climb. And sometimes it's okay and it's actually better to go back to school and once again take that leap of faith because like I said, you can never stop learning. Learning will always, always, always benefit you in one way or another. And if you want to go back to school, my best advice for you is go back to school. There's a reason you want to go back to school. There's a reason that your mind and everything is telling you that you want to learn something new. And that could honestly change the entire course of your life. It might not, but it could.
Yes, don't be afraid to just scratch the itch and just see it through because you never know what can happen. So then what happens to you after Seneca?
So after Seneca, I was freelancing a lot. I actually worked in public relations for a bit with a couple different agencies. I worked with notable awards. And just starting to get like more and more clients. I ended up going to Los Angeles for under a year and working with just a lot of really cool companies and honing my craft. Eventually, I started with Streets of Toronto when it was just owned by a guy, and it was eventually bought out by Post City Magazines. And I was only really supposed to stay with them to transition some of their staff onto the Streets of Toronto team. And then I was kind of planning on stepping back and doing my own thing again. But I really loved the team. Lauren, who is the owner of Post City, is unbelievable. And we clicked, and he was like, well, take the social media side and let's figure out a way to grow this even more. And we just reached 500,000 followers on Instagram, and now 2 or 3 years later, and I couldn't be happier because he gives me the freedom to really experiment with the socials while also the belief in me that we can make something special with Streets of Toronto. And I think with Streets of Toronto, it's not just about the one dimension of here's all these businesses in Toronto. It's really storytelling and journalism in a lot of ways, but also showcasing unique and cool businesses in Toronto.
Congratulations for hitting that milestone. And it shows that you were open to the opportunities that came to you and trying new things. And you ended up doing something that you probably, after you graduated, didn't think you were going to do and found success in it.
For sure. I think that's the thing. I don't even know necessarily what I thought I was going to do. I knew I wanted to a degree, be in front of the camera and be a journalist. But I also loved the behind the scenes of actually creating content. And this was the happiest medium of it all. Like it all came full circle. And I was lucky enough to be one of those people that, yeah, left the dream job to find another dream job.
And I want to ask you about getting started in freelancing, and especially when you start to take on your first clients of your own, because something that I see a lot is people almost have imposter syndrome, and then they want to downplay their skills, and they feel like when they start monetizing, they want to downplay themselves a bit and not charge what they're fully worth. Did you experience that type of imposter syndrome when you started?
I still to this day have imposter syndrome 100%. And I think it's a very, very, very real thing to experience in this industry. Instagram is the highlight reel of someone's life. And so when you are in social media or even media as a whole, you're constantly looking at these highlight reels of everyone else and comparing it to yourself. And that is a very easy way to feel down on yourself and feel like, oh, am I worthy to be in this landscape? Like this is, yes, such a cool career, but what makes me cool enough to be part of this? How is this even happening? And I think with imposter syndrome, for sure, it doesn't matter who you are, it affects everyone to a degree. And if it doesn't, you are really lucky because you do not suffer with anxiety.
Oh, yeah. I get it all the time, too. I think that people see that I one survivor. I must have all the stuff going for me. I'm like, listen, I am still hustling just like the next person, okay? I am just as scared as everybody else.
Well, yeah, I think right. Like, and I think people will look at you and be like, "Wow, you are like so cool. You're so powerful." I don't know if you've experienced this as well, but when people constantly are saying like, "Oh, I can't believe you're doing this. Like, you're so cool. Like, this is such a cool career path." Sometimes those questions also really like impact the imposter syndrome in me because
Mhm.
I'm like, oh, wait, what? Like I am? Like, oh, I don't know. And so it's like that when you're sad and someone asks you, are you okay?
Mhm.
And you're like, oh shit, I would have been okay. I wasn't going to cry, but now that you asked me, are you okay? Now I'm gonna cry. Very similar.
It's so weird. I feel like sometimes getting the positive feedback and the compliment puts more pressure on you.
Yeah. There's always that next level. Okay, well, what to do next? What am I gonna do next? How am I gonna top this? How is this gonna be even better? And what's the next goal?
So when you start having that internal dialogue, how do you talk yourself down from it?
Honestly, sometimes it's really just disconnecting
Mhm.
from social media and really like I am an introvert in a lot of ways. I'm an introvert who displays as an extrovert. So I love my alone time. And sometimes all I need is to be in my bed with a cup of tea or a glass of wine and a good book and not think about it.
Hmm.
Because as soon as I start to think about all of these things, it can be like this downward spiral. And I think that's okay. I think it's normal to have self doubt, but to let yourself get sucked up in it and continue in these like downward spirals is also a very bad place to be. So sometimes you just have to pull yourself completely out of the situation and put yourself in a completely different situation, at least for like a few hours to get your mind right.
100%. I think we all have to figure out the way that we can manage that pressure because otherwise can become a lot. I think that there's so much pressure on everybody.
And it's scary too because it's your life, right?
Hmm.
We're in a business that, as much as it seems fun and everything, and in a lot of ways, it is a lot of fun, there is always that pressure that, well, this is also my work. This is how I make a living. Like, what happens if this all just one day, like, disappears?
Hmm.
Like, what am I going to do then?
Yes. Yeah, that's the thing. It's hard, I think, also because it's like your job is so closely tied to you and who you are and how you present on camera and how you manage all your
Yeah,
clients, where it's like hard to come up with that boundary. But there is a boundary. There is a boundary.
right. That's the thing. Like, at one point, you do have to realize even like my Instagram, like that is one side of me that I am showing. I, as a person, am so much more and am so much more complex than what I display on either my TikTok or my Instagram or on any of my clients' pages.
Yes. And something that just triggered in my mind during this interview. Now I'm thinking, okay, if I'm going to compliment you and say, oh my gosh, Kaitlin, you're so young and you've achieved so much. You've worked at Streets of Toronto. You have your own agency. You're traveling. You're doing all this stuff. I know that probably being on the receiving end of that can feel like a bit of imposter syndrome, but it's not like I'm saying that to you and I'm saying, okay, now you've done all this. You better keep it up. And I expect you to go even higher. It's like when someone is complimenting you, they are just complimenting you for who you are and what you've done so far. And I think that that's now something I want to keep in mind in the future too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, right? The way that we interpret something that someone is saying isn't always how they actually are saying it. And I think that it's this weird dynamic of our own mental thoughts a lot of the times can take the happiness
Yeah.
out of one thing and make it this darkness, and that's not always a great thing, but yes, I think remembering that sometimes a compliment really just is a compliment, and we need to take it at that face value and not look into this deeper root of, okay, well, what's next then? Okay, what's coming up? How do I keep up with this?
Yes, everybody accept your compliments and accept that you are accomplished and you are worthy and amazing as you are. So then after you were freelancing, did it take a while for you to start building momentum with your business? And did you reach a moment where you thought, okay, this is actually happening. I can actually support myself and do this for a while?
Yeah, for sure. I think there were multiple moments of that. Like, I think there's always times where, even to this day, though I know I'm doing well, there's that part of me that I'm like, oh, well, do I want to do something else? Like, do I want to go into a 9 to 5 job? Do I want to have the stability of having a company that is there Monday to Friday and then I can actually sign off on the weekends? Because in entrepreneurship, you're on all the
Yes.
time. As even when you are off, you are on. To some degree, your brain, it's impossible to turn your brain off. It's impossible to not always be thinking about something work related as an entrepreneur, or at least in my experience it is. And so there's always parts of me that even when I'm at like my most successful and I have a lot of retainer clients and I'm getting big spots in different publications, there is always that part of my brain that's like, do I want a 9 to 5? Do I want to have the stability that some of my friends have, knowing that Monday to Friday and then Saturday and Sunday they can actually shut off?
I know it's always the constant back and forth. And do you feel like you're satisfied where you are now, where you're like, no, I know this is where I want to be, or you still have those nagging thoughts pulling you back to the 9 to 5?
I think that's the thing. I'm so happy because I have the stability of Streets of Toronto and Post City magazines, but then there's also that part of me that I don't think that will ever go away. I think it doesn't matter what I would be doing. I think there's always a part of everyone that views the grass greener on the other side. You can be so proud and happy with everything that you accomplish and still have that, and that is very normal, and I think that's okay so long as you're not always letting that element get you down.
So I want to pivot a little bit and talk to you about content creation and journalism. So how does your journalism background intersect with your approach to content creation?
Oh my gosh, it's everything. I think learning how to create content and the storytelling element of journalism are always intertwined because good content, yes, it needs to be beautiful and everything, but it also needs to always tell a story. Whether or not you're selling a product, whether or not you're doing a recipe reel, at its root, content is telling a story. And so I think all of those things in my life kind of came and intertwined itself. Whereas when I get a new project with a client, let's say it's a tourism board, I'm thinking, okay, what's the underlying story that I'm trying to tell? And how am I going to tell it in a way that is not only beautiful, but also creative? And that's the creation side.
I feel with content creation, I mean, I go on and off about getting into content creation. Sometimes I'm into it, and other times I'm like, I'm not going to make anything for like a month, and it is what it is. But I think that it's increasingly becoming important for people to grow their profiles, grow their businesses, but it can be really intimidating. And I think it's great you've simplified it so people know that it's simply just storytelling. Do you have advice for people who want to be approaching content creation for their businesses? What's the best and most simple way they can approach it?
For me, once again, I think because I own the content creation agency and it's very much a business, when I'm approaching a client, my biggest thing is I always ask them for 3 key messages. One being the main key message that they want told, and then 2 secondary and third thoughts that they would like also told in this piece of content. From that, that's where I build my story. So I mean, when you're in elementary school, let's say, remember how we were learning to write stories? You didn't just start and dive into chapter 1, like once upon a time. You actually took the time to be on a blank sheet of paper and start writing out what you want to happen, like the line of the story. I still do that to this day. That's how I start with any project, because how are you supposed to sell anything unless you know the story behind it? How are you supposed to really make something that's worth consuming unless there's a story that makes sense? So I would start with an outline.
That advice, I think it will help not just in social media, but just overall with your communications, because it's not just about saying stuff for the sake of getting it out and saying it, but it's thinking about, what do I want people to take away from this? What do I want them to know? How do I want them to feel? And then that's what informs what you actually say.
And I think that's the thing too, right? It's not even always having to, I think sometimes we forget that visuals play such a huge part in content as well, that we always feel like the key messaging needs to fit into the script. And that's not always true. You can tell a story through visuals as well. And so every prop that you put into a piece, every background element that you have, all of that contributes to your overall story. When you remember that a story is dimensional and has layers, I think that's when you really succeed with your content.
I know people get so wrapped up in, oh, there's these types of content, like the get ready with me or the OOTD or the this or that. And I think people focus so much on the formats, but really just a good story is what works. It's just like who TF did I marry? Like that
Yeah.
did not follow any of the rules of social media. Like literally broke every single rule, but it was just a good story. So we all tuned
Yeah.
in.
Yeah. And entertaining, right? And there's different ways to entertain, and there's different audiences that you're creating for. In the social media sphere, there's room for everyone, because it doesn't matter if you are on the book talk side of things, or if you are on the food talk side of things, or sports. Like, if you have a true interest in something and you want to create content for it, dive right in, find your niche, figure it out, and tell your story. Tell the story that you want to tell.
Yeah, there's truly room for everybody. And actually, with a former MIT grad also here, I'm so curious about what you think about how things are kind of flowing back and forth. Where you were a journalist, you started now working in content creation. We're also seeing content creators now showing up at red carpets. Well, not showing up, they're getting invited to red carpets, doing press junkets. So it's kind of like things are going back and forth. How do you feel about how everything's moving right now?
I love it.
Mhm.
I get so upset when I see things that portray influencers in such a way that they don't belong somewhere. Because no one ever wants to feel like they don't belong where they are. Just because someone's life looks a little bit different than yours, it doesn't necessarily give you the right to say they don't belong. I think with the red carpets, it can be a lot of journalists or a lot of like celebrities who are like, well, they're just an influencer, they're just a TikToker. But a lot of people are consuming TikTok content. A lot of people are consuming different types of content. Just because there's this new avenue doesn't mean that they're any less worthy than a television program reporting on it, or a star. Because in a lot of ways, these TikTok stars are just that. They are a star in their own right, and they've worked hard in whatever way that they did to amass the following that they have. And I think sometimes we forget that they're just people too.
Yeah, I think that overall, I think that it's almost like people struggle with any type of disruption. And then
Yeah.
right now, it's how TikTokers or people with social media platforms are disrupting things. I think, for one, there's always must be room for journalism because of
Yeah.
how important journalism is to the world, how important it is to keep us informed and to hold people accountable. There must always be room for journalism. But
Yeah.
I even remember, oh my gosh, almost 10 years ago now, when I was working in public relations, one of my clients was YouTube, and I was trying to invite entertainment press to YouTube related events. And sometimes the feedback was, oh, we only cover real celebrities. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking, there's 100,000 people lined up outside to see these people. How do you
Yeah.
not think they're real celebrities? So I think it's almost like how people are like, oh, this new generation is crazy. I think that people were saying that 10 years ago about YouTubers. People are now saying
Yeah.
discrediting things about TikTokers, and it's just what is happening when things change.
And I think the thing too with all of this is that this even happened with Netflix. Like,
Yes.
way back when you think about it, oh, you're a Netflix actor. Now look at Netflix. Like, literally, Netflix is the biggest, I think the biggest streaming platform, and something that you would be honored to work on and have as a partner with. So I think you're right. Anytime there's a little bit of disruption, people are automatically like, oh, what's happening? Like, no, I like the status quo. Let me go back into my little box. And that's not the reality of a ever-changing world. I think also there's a lot of TikTokers that approach journalism in such a way that I'm really like, what's his name? Straw Hat Goofy.
Oh, I don't know him.
He's this like entertainment kind of journalist, I would say, that talks about movies in a critical way as well. And he's so impressive the way that he, like the lens that he has on movies, that it's very, I'm like, did you go to MIT? Because you have an MIT perspective on this movie. But yeah, like he is doing journalism just in a different format. And I think that's okay. I think there's, once again, in this industry, I think there's room for us all.
Exactly.
News Daddy too.
Who's
Have
News
you
Daddy?
News Daddy? Oh my gosh. Okay, so News Daddy, he's like, he has, I think now the most liked comment on any social platform, but he is essentially every day putting out multiple like mini newscasts on different things. And he does it in such a cool, interesting, and engaging way. And people in the community, we comment all like we make comments, we interact with each other, we interact with him, and he does it in such a fun but also smart way that he's not just regurgitating information, he's also asking a question at the end. So yeah, who's to say that it's not a type of journalism?
Yeah.
It's just a different type of journalism.
Oh, yeah. And as we established at the beginning of the conversation, even when you were working in daytime TV, there were the rumblings of how there's not jobs for journalists and newsrooms are shrinking. So it's like maybe News Daddy back in the day could have gotten a job with a newspaper, but that's not
True.
available. So they just have to make it happen with what's available to them. And right now it's TikTok.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing too. A lot of people jump on the fake news side of it, and completely fair. That is a very, very fair argument to be made when like fact checking isn't there. But the reality of the journalism industry is that a lot of these big newspapers, a lot of these big broadcasters got rid of their fact checking departments. That showed a huge pivot in our industry many, many, many moons ago when this was all happening. So it's easy to critique like a one-off influencer that's trying to report on news, but then we also have to look at it from a critical lens across the board, because a lot of big publications also sometimes put out false information and have to retract a statement as well. We just don't see it as much because we take it very much for their word.
Ooh, I love having conversations like this with fellow MIT grads. Thank you
Right?
for indulging me.
You can definitely tell we're both MIT.
Yeah. I know. If we described the program so weird at the beginning, maybe listening to that part of the conversation has helped to make sense of it.
Yeah, honestly.
So, Kaitlin, before we wrap up, do you have any outstanding advice for anybody who is thinking about making some type of pivot in their career?
If you really, really want to do something and you have this feeling that you need to do it, I think you should do it, because at the end, we live one life and you never want to get to the end of that life with a regret and something that you could have changed.
Yes, exactly. It's better to try something and then who knows, maybe it doesn't work out. Then you can always go back to the job you had before. Or who knows, you're leaving yourself open to something even better than you imagined.
Exactly.
Kaitlin, thank you so much for chatting with me today. It's been so inspirational. It's been so fun to chat about media and journalism with you. If people want to keep up with you, where can they do that?
For sure. So they can follow along at streetsoftoronto.com or follow us on Instagram at Streets of Toronto. And my Instagram is Kaitlin.Narciso.
Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you. This was so much fun.
Thank you, Kaitlin, for being on the podcast. I love speaking to a fellow alum from my alma mater, and I love speaking to an entrepreneurial woman who knows what it's like to take risks and can show us that there is success once you get to the other side of a pivot. Now, I love to answer a question at the end of each episode, and a question I got asked over the weekend, which I think is very, very appropriate considering this episode. Somebody asked me, where did I go to school? So why not do a rundown of where I went to school? As you heard in the episode, I did my undergrad at the University of Western Ontario, taking the MIT or Media Information and Technoculture program. And as you heard in the conversation, I loved it. We were able to study all sorts of media, whether it was reality TV, children's media, eco media, and greenwashing, and mainstream media, and how politics intersects with journalism. I got to learn about so much different types of media, and I got to learn so much about how to think critically about everything I see. So I don't know if you recognize that I use that lens when I podcast, when I write, when I tell stories about my life, but I've always loved and appreciated that I developed this ability to think critically because of this program that I went to, which was the MIT program. At the same time, I actually was doing a degree and diploma program. So I also went to Fanshawe College to study multimedia design and production. So when I was in that program, we were learning things like graphic design, web design, photography, print design for magazines, all sorts of different multimedia design. And the idea of that program was to give you a bit of a taste of different types of design. And then afterwards, you would go off and you would specialize in something. I was doing this at the same time as doing my undergrad at Western and doing the MIT program. So I was bouncing between two schools for this degree and diploma program. And I actually did not pursue any of those designs after I finished graduation. But it was helpful after I went on to work in public relations and marketing as I was working with different designers. So I loved my undergrad experience. As you can hear from the passion I had in talking to Kaitlin, I take so much of the skills that I learned in terms of critical thinking with me. And then after that, I did a year. So I did a postgrad certificate at Humber College, which is here in Toronto. So I studied public relations. And after that, that was my career for 10 years before I went on Survivor. So a lot of people are unclear about what public relations is. I think that sometimes people thought I was just like a customer service rep or something. And there's nothing wrong with being a customer service rep. I actually had many retail customer-facing customer service jobs in my lifetime. But the way that I would describe public relations is that it was the management of the reputation and the public image of a company or a person. So, for example, sometimes I'd be working with a company that was brand new and we'd have to figure out how to make people aware of it and how to build up its reputation from scratch. Sometimes I'd be working with a company that's been around for a long time and I'd be working to figure out, okay, how can we get them a bit more attention or how can we pivot their reputation? I also worked on more challenging things like when a company is in crisis, when something negative happens, how do you respond to the criticism and the negativity? And then eventually start to rebuild the public image and rebuild the reputation so that it can eventually become neutral and hopefully favorable as time goes on. So it actually was a really strategic job, got a lot out of it. I made so many memories working in public relations. And I'm happy that all that school and all of those jobs have led me to where I am today, where I can speak to you every week. So thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you get your podcast. Thank you for chatting and for hanging out with me today, and I will be happy to see you next Monday.